Then with 2 out, Campanella blasts a home run, his first hit of the series, and Brooklyn leads 2-0.
In 1960, baseball was the most popular sport in America. By 1980, it lost that title to football. One man foresaw baseball's decline and tried to prevent it. That man was Branch Rickey. On August 2nd, 1960, Rickey walked into a Chicago hotel believing that the moment had finally arrived for him to save baseball from itself.
Branch Rickey was the great saint of baseball.
Branch Rickey revolutionized baseball, first with the farm system for the St. Louis Cardinals.
His second revolution was the integration of baseball, signing Jackie Robinson, breaking the color line that had existed in baseball since the turn of the 20th century.
Now Rickey was prepared to revolutionize the game again. For years, he'd been preaching to anyone who would listen that baseball was fading. He was not about to let it fall out of public favor, not without a fight.
His motto, his mantra remained, never grow accustomed to the emotions of continuous defeat.
And so, on a steamy afternoon in Chicago, Rickey sat in a meeting room at the Conrad Hilton Hotel. Joining him were the 8 representatives of a new baseball enterprise, the Continental League. They had come to Chicago in the hope of forming a third major league. Rickey was about to speak when he was cut off by the man presiding over the gathering, LA Dodgers owner Walter O'Malley.
Walter O'Malley was a lawyer and an engineer, and he had sold his other businesses and decided that if he was going to get to be rich, he was going to get rich in baseball.
O'Malley began, "Gentlemen, we are here to make serious decisions." He was about to extend the offer that would end baseball's long history as America's most popular sport. This is where the story ends. It begins 3 years earlier in 1957. O'Malley's Dodgers were still in Brooklyn, but not for long. Los Angeles was beckoning. O'Malley had failed to convince New York to let him build a new stadium in downtown Brooklyn to replace Ebbets Field.
Ebbets Field, the Dodgers' historic home, was aging, cramped, and most importantly, didn't have enough parking. And in 1957, what really mattered was parking, because most of his fans had left Brooklyn and were no longer commuting by streetcar.
He was ready to leave, and worse still, he was going to be joined by Horace Stoneham, who was prepared to move his New York Giants to San Francisco.
This is a very embarrassing situation. They've not lost one baseball team, they've lost 2. Nobody's ever done that.
Desperate, New York City dispatched a lawyer named William Shea to find a club.
Shea thinks this is going to be easy. Surely another National League team, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Philadelphia, teams that were not doing particularly well, would surely want to move to New York, but nobody wants to come.
Spurned at every turn, Shea was told to travel to Ohio and seek out Branch Rickey. Perhaps he could help. Rickey was 77 and living in a restless and unwanted retirement. He'd been out of the game since 1955, when the Pittsburgh Pirates fired him after 5 dreadful seasons as their general manager.
And his great reputation was tarnished. He goes off into retirement and is at his farm in Ohio, waiting to see if he has one more act.
Baseball had indeed fallen on hard times. Attendance was declining.
The rise of pro football in the 50s, Rickey felt, was a horror and not accidental, that it was football moving into territory that baseball, through negligence, had defaulted on.
Rickey had concluded the game needed a powerful jolt to propel it into the future.
Rickey wasn't just thinking in terms of business alone. He was thinking of the salvation. Rickey wanted to save baseball. So Rickey began to work on what you might want to call a manifesto.
He decided that, a third league was the way to go.
Rickey envisioned a radically different third league. Its 8 teams would not play the big leaguers until they were ready. Instead, they would play one another.
Rickey wanted every team to have the chance to win. His calculus being, if every team has a chance to win, fans will come to the games.
Shea listened and then set out across the country to see if other cities might want to join in the crusade. Meanwhile, baseball trundled on, the old order seemingly oblivious to the changes bubbling around it. After all, baseball had reason to believe it was impervious to assault.
In 1960, Gallup did a survey of America's favorite spectator sports. 34% identified baseball, 21% identified football. And so baseball, even with declining attendance, even with the rise of other games, still deluded itself into thinking that business could go on as it had always gone on.
Little had changed. Not the ballparks, not the way of doing business, and not the belief that they could go on effectively owning the rights of every professional baseball player and team in the country. The owners knew about Shea's campaign. What they didn't know was who was behind it.
Bill Shea emerges from his travels, and he announces the formation of a new major league, just as Branch Rickey had described it.
The story was page one news across the country.
The owners expressed their enthusiasm. The commissioner expressed his enthusiasm. They didn't mean a bit of it. And they set to work immediately to do what they could to scuttle this thing before it started.
To the owners, a new league threatened more than competition for the best players. It jeopardized their grand plan. The owners had transformed their ballparks into television studios and wanted to charge fans to watch the games. The fewer the teams, the greater the reward for each owner. The Continental League had to go. But Rickey was not backing down.
Branch Rickey was a friend of the owners, but he didn't understand them. He didn't understand that their imperatives were not his, that their desires were not his. He wanted to save baseball and make it the game for the nation. And they wanted to make a buck. And that's all they cared about.
But even as the grip on their monopoly weakened, the owners still had one last powerful hand to play: temptation. The Continentals who joined Rickey and Shea wanted places in baseball's exclusive club.
Branch Rickey comes to Chicago in early August of 1960, and he's thinking, the moment of the game's salvation and of my redemption is at hand.
Walter O'Malley rose and made an offer.
And he says, let's make a deal. We'll take in 4 of you guys now, immediately, and we promise to take in the other 4 soon enough. But in return, no more third league, you become a part of us.
The Continentals retired to a back room to talk.
They close the door, they look at each other, and they let out a scream of victory. They win. They're part of the big leagues. They pat Branch Rickey on the back. They say, thank you very much. They go back inside, and they say, deal.
Well, the Continental League owners were deliriously happy, but Rickey had had his dealings with O'Malley before, so he knew better than to believe the text, and he looked for the subtext.
It takes them only about 6 weeks to get screwed.
Baseball did expand. The National League added teams in New York and Houston. The American League added clubs in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles. Baseball would expand in precisely the way Rickey had warned against. All 4 teams were losers.
Baseball had its chance. It had a blueprint, it had a model, it had a visionary, and it ignored it all.
Football, on the other hand, was doing well, and by the early 1970s had passed baseball as the nation's most popular sport.
Baseball allowed another game, a competing game, to grab the nation's heart. And they've never gotten it back. And for that, the game has only itself to blame.